And we are back on the 0 hour in a nation where violence continues against young Black men, in a nation where protests continue, in a nation where the struggle seems never to be over. We are pleased that once again joining us now to talk about these and related issues is Reverend Osagyefo Sekou, who is a Freeman Fellow with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and Scholar in Residence at the Martin Luther King Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. Reverend Sekou is also the author of a forthcoming book entitled Riot Music, Hip Hop, Race, and the Meaning of the London Riots of 2011, which seems to me to be getting a little bit more relevant to our own situation as time progresses, but we'll talk about that. Reverend Sekou, thanks so much for joining us.
It's such a blessing to talk to you again, dear brother.
And to you. So listen, the last time you and I talked was during the height of the conflicts between the police and the demonstrators in Ferguson. I know you're from that area yourself. Even conflict doesn't seem to be the right word because that suggests a certain level of parity that is hardly the case when you have a highly militarized police force going up against unarmed civilians. But in those days and that time, we spoke. What is your sense of the situation as it now? So let's start with Ferguson, not as the be all and end all of our conversation, but perhaps as the teaching moment or the teaching point in time and space to leverage from there. What happened? What is going on right now in Ferguson in your assessment?
Well, dear brother, we definitely turned a corner this weekend with Ferguson October, with a number of protests that took place, marches, rallies, and a massive civil disobedience where several dozen of folks of clergy as well as activists and citizens committed to the Democratic Project were arrested. Our movement was disciplined. It was youth-led with elders supporting them and being committed to who they are and standing with the young folks. We showed up late, but we showed up.
Well, and thank you for that. Now, when you say it's youth led, I know there have been a couple youth groups. We had someone on talking to us about the young people there, and who are the young people leading this phase of the process?
It's almost too many to name, but there's a group called Lost Voices, which camped out almost day one on West Florissant, and their campsite was raided. And so then there's a group, Tribe X, which is holding the Occupy Slough right now. And then there's Hands Up United, of which Tefpo and Tehran Russell are part leaders of. And then there is Millennial Activists United, which Ashley Yates, Brittany Farrell, as well as Alexis Templeton. And so there are several other folks who are involved in this work.
Okay, and how does that work when you go in and some of the older leaders come in? When Cornel West, who is bringing his gravity to this situation as well, and some others come in and take leadership from these younger folks. Do you all sit down and meet? Do you ask them?
A number of meetings have taken place that have been intergenerational, but most of it happens in the street, in the sense that in addition to the training that we're done, the real question for young folks is that have you been there with us? And that's part of what's important. To do so. And so there have been clergy who have been present, like Reverend Renita Lampkin, Reverend Tracy Blackman in particular. And one cannot say enough about the role that Black women have played and that the women have played in this work.
Now, we hear talk that there's been some feeling that maybe some of the older institutional forces for change perhaps disappointed in some way the movement, and that's why the leadership shifted. Is that the case, or you think it's just a matter of the energy is now with the young people because it's their struggle and their fight?
Well, I mean, clearly there is a generational challenge, but in addition to generational, which may be the tenor and tone of an older generation, and particularly a kind of popular notion of how civil rights activism is supposed to happen, primarily in the courts and through particular forms of protest and a particular kind of respectability politics that shape that understanding. But it's also ideological and attitudinal. What do you fundamentally believe about poor black youth? And in the tradition of someone like Ella Baker, who was a hallmark of the civil rights movement, who encouraged young organizers like Kwame Ture and Willie Ricks Mukasa and others to build out their own organization, Diane Nash and others, what we see is something attitudinal. Do you fundamentally trust the genius of the poor? This is the words of the great Ella Baker. And so in that kind of understanding of trusting young people to do the work. And so if your attitude is such that you can listen to young people who may curse, who have their pants sag, who are tatted up, if you can listen to them and be in solidarity with them, follow their leadership, and then there are going to be tensions, right? There are going to be tensions, no question about the ways in which old folks and young folks interact. You know, W. Du Bois in his 1904 text, essay, I think, The Morals and Manners of Negroes, and they asked young in Philadelphia, 1904, 06, asking them, what's up with young people? And these folks back then, over a century ago, say it's the music they're listening to and the dances that they're doing. This is a century ago. So there's always these kind of tensions between generations. The question becomes is that do you have the attitudinal approach that whereby you can submit yourself to young black folks' leadership, and the secondary ideologically, do you fundamentally believe that being in the streets, radical, raucous, rageful protest has a significant role to play in the street, or do you fundamentally believe something more and a more acceptable form of protest and public discourse, public mind that is that won't trigger white anxiety? And so that's the ideological question.
Well, and brilliantly stated. And I guess I would say, Reverend Sekou, my question for you then is, as you were talking, I was thinking, has change, I was asking myself, has change ever come in difficult situations without causing some discomfort to someone somewhere, including not only the ones doing the afflicting and the ones standing by idly, but perhaps even some of those who have been fighting for change for a long time? Isn't discomfort and a willingness to challenge your own preconceptions part of the process itself?
Well, I think the reality is that it has to be that there are always a multiplicity of factors and strategies that have impacted change in this country. So it's the NAACP in the courts combined with SNCC on the ground in the streets, both organizing and protesting. It's King playing as a broker between the powers, black elite organizations, and powers while having capacity to do large mobilization, right? So all of that is happening, and then we still wind up with a compromised voting rights and civil rights bill. So those changes that emerge when all three of those things are in play. In the age of Obama, given that a black face represents the state, the more agitating, the less respectable form, which is being in the street outside agitating, bearing critique, again, they attempt to strike it out and say that is not what we need now.
Right, and I think there is that tendency also in certain circles to say that that problems in the Black youth community could be solved by more of a bootstraps attitude, which I think is perhaps tonally off at a time when literally the young African American community is under the gun.
I mean, well, the whole community is under the gun, right? Occupy Wall Street is really white folks realizing what black folks have always known. The system does not work. That it works for a few, and that working of the system is tenuous at best for the vast majority of Americans, save the 1%. And so, given that black youth are part and parcel, constitutive of, and make up the constitution of the 99%, their leadership, and given the high level of policing, the expansion of the prison and industrial complex, their demonization in public speech, their public speech being mocked, in public space and popular culture. Their cultural norms both being criticized and then chastised, then exploited and sold back to the general public vis-a-vis Iggy and these kinds of rappers who are deploying, mocking, and making money off of black cultural styles, whether it be Justin Bieber or others, right, who are in attempting to reify and justify stereotypical formations and accentuations of what it means to be black while claiming certain forms of authenticity in the public space, right? So when all of that happens, right, the idea that black people and black youth could look, it face all of that existential crisis, economic crisis, right? Social crisis, educational crisis, all of that, and then they stand up and cause the nation to pause and honor their humanity. It's a beautiful thing and a beautiful moment in the history of global struggle.
Well, I love to hear you describe it that way, and there's so many dimensions to what you said. And I was thinking as you were speaking, this is a long process. I mean, during the days of the early days of the civil rights struggle in the 1950s, you had Elvis Presley doing the same thing Iggy's doing. You had
exactly.
Iggy Azalea. You had the
Iggy is the Elvis, is the postmodern Elvis.
Right. Don't be cruel. And all shook up. But and I guess I guess my question is, and I think the other piece of it, and you were describing that too for us, that people think, particularly the comfortable, let's say, white majority, unless they're part of an Occupy movement or something, we think we live in a democracy, in a comfortable situation, until there is a confrontation that kind of rips away the mask, whether it's Occupy being driven out of a public space illegally, or the far more brutal, situation in Ferguson, where peaceful demonstrators are met with all the ferocity of an invading army with tanks and everything else. So I guess the question is, that we've got about a minute left. Where do we go from here? What should we be looking for from here?
Dear brother, we continue to go where we've always been, and that's to the streets. Young people are going to stay in the streets, and if we are courageous, we'll stand with them and we'll stand behind them, because they are all of our children. The nation has been presented with a choice, right? My grandmama said like this here. She'll say, I thank God that I'm not what I was, and I'm not what I'm going to be. So we are grateful that America is not what it was. Jim Crow laws, slavery, lynching, right? So it's not what it was, but it's not what it's going to be, because given that police are killing black folks every 28 hours in America, given that 1/4 of black people in Ferguson live in poverty, given that 1 in 3 black men in New York City are unemployed, and the numbers are higher in some communities, right? When you look at Boston, my own beloved city, right, where I am privileged to serve the First Baptist Church in Jamaica Plains, when you look there at stop and frisk and the new data that the ACLU has released concerning African American policing, but when you look at all of that, right, it's not what it's supposed to be. And so the choice has become before the nation. Young black people have presented the nation with that choice.
Well, I think the best way to leave it is, we will meet you there. Reverend Osagyefo Sekou, well, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Bless you, dear brother. Be well.
And you. And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.